Well, hello everyone, and welcome to McDuff Lives. I'm John O'Loughlin, and here it is 11:02 in the morning on November 20, on March 28th, 2023. A beautiful spring morning here, and let's see. We're having trouble. It says streaming to my Rumble. All right, just a second. I'm going to have to fix this. Can't have that. Oh, just one second. See how quickly I can get this done. We have to make a copy of the RTMP and go over to the thanks for being with me. I'm just handling a little technical issue and it's apparently still not fixed. So one more try here. Pardon me for the delay. We're just handling a little technical issue. And hello, everyone. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to McDuff Lives. I having a little technical issue with my feed over to Rumble, and I'm not really sure why. Um, I have tried to reload it and it's just not working. I'm trying one more thing to get the Rumble channel lined up, and it just doesn't seem to be working. Um, if my producer friend is available, maybe she could come over here and let me ask her to do something for me. But I don't understand. Hello, Corky. Hello, Rick. Hello, Jimmy, and Road Warrior, and anybody else who's here. I suppose I'll go ahead with the show because I don't seem to be able to figure out the tech problem over at Rumble, and I apologize for that. Okay, it's now 8 minutes after 11, and I think I'll go ahead and start the show. So once again, wanted to welcome you to McDuff Lives, and this morning I'm doing a Mindfields, and I started doing Mindfields a couple years ago because sometimes I just had things on my mind that I wanted to share that I thought might be worth, um, starting a conversation about, or otherwise just to make sure that I put something down because I didn't want to let it go. I thought these might be important connections that we can use in our studies. So this is another example of that, although it's a little different because this time I'm going to rely on somebody else's YouTube channel. Now, I've used other people's books before and writings on EIR, the Executive Intelligence Review, have been read by me and commented a lot of times. I've read, maybe 20 or 30 books on my show, a number of them being taken down when YouTube crashed my first channel. But nevertheless, I've still got over 300 videos up on McDuff Lives 1, 2, and 3, most of which are either books or interviews. But now we're up to number 207 of my Minefield series. And so to introduce a new idea, which is that I want to share one of my favorite historians with you. And his name is TIK, T-I-K. He just goes by TIK. Don't know his real name, but he's got a very, very popular YouTube channel, couple 100,000, I believe, subscribers. And I got hooked on him a couple years ago when I noticed his very detailed battlefield summaries of the Stalingrad battle. And it's something that you just can't imagine how much detail he went into and how much time it took for him to create what is really an organic account of the Battle of Stalingrad, starting way back in the June of 43, before the armies had even gotten close to Stalingrad. And then the progress of the Sixth Army is just an amazing amount of work that went into that. So anyway, I'm going to bring TIK's channel up so you can see where it is. It's on YouTube. And let's get him. It's called TIK History, okay? So here, let me just share this screen. And so this is just his cover page, and you can see a lot of what he's done has been on World War II. Here's the Stalingrad series. Here's this series on economics, which I have gotten hooked on because he's really, really brilliant about economics and sees through a lot of this Hegelian nonsense that we have to wade through to understand what's really going on. So, and that's what he does in this show that we're going to be concentrating on this morning. This one he calls the Lib Lab Con, and his subtitle is Why Oswald Mosley Turned to Fascism. And so I'm going to get that one up and let TIK start the story. The point that I want to make today is what happened to liberalism And in order to understand what happened to liberalism, we have to understand how liberalism started and where did it come from? Why did it become now the vehicle for deep state actions when it really started out as a common person's uh, party? Well, let me get out of the way and let TIK tell the story. All right, why Oswald Mosley turned to fascism. We've talked about Mosley a lot lately in our Ordo Ab Chaos series, his relationship to the Mitford sisters and, excuse me, Marcy? Oh, all right, thank you. Note from the producer there. So I'm sorry we're not on Rumble, and I had a technical problem and I just can't solve it. So we're going forward on McDuff Lives 2 on YouTube, Facebook at McDuff Lives, and you can also watch on Twitter, although that's not recorded. Those go down as soon as you see them. The backup will also always be on BitChute at McDuff Uncensored, by the way. If you need to see this afterwards or want to find it in the future or tell people where to get it, you can get all of my shows on McDuff Uncensored on BitChute, which is where we archive everything. Now, I was going to go ahead and let
In order to understand Oswald Mosley and his conversion to fascism, we need to start our story a little bit before this time. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, the people worked on farms from dawn till dusk, receiving low pay for back-breaking labour. The life expectancy of a British person was 35. In London between the years 1730 and 1749, 74.5% of children died before they reached the age of 5. That's 3/4 of all children. Imagine a world where that happened, because that world was the reality for the vast majority of human history. Centuries before the miracles of modern medicine, England was awash with parentless, sick and dying children. Farmers in places like France and Russia hibernated for 6 months of the year due to a lack of food. I don't have evidence of that happening in Britain, but I do have evidence that 1 in 10 families in England were below the breadline during the Georgian era, and people did starve to death in Britain during the pre-industrial and early industrial era. But in the late 1700s, people started to move from the farms to the cities as a result of industrialization. Now, this is not to say that there wasn't poverty in the cities. Of course there was, but the industrial jobs weren't as long-houred as the agricultural jobs, and they were better paid as well. If they weren't, then why would people have left the idyllic farms to go to the squalor cities? It doesn't make sense for them to choose the worst option. And the reason why they chose the terrible city jobs was because the farm jobs were even worse. You were basically impoverished by working on the farms, whereas you had a better chance of survival working in the factories. As a result, poverty decreased from a child mortality rate of 74.5% in the 1730s and 40s, it was down to 31.8% in the 1810 to 1829 period. A staggering decrease in child deaths for the first time in human history. And just a note, Charles Dickens was writing during this era. Oliver Twist was published in the late 1830s. So at a time when industrialization had barely gotten going, And as urbanization was happening, Dickens was seeing all this poverty and was writing about it. And that's fair enough. 31.8% of children are still dying as late as 1829. But what is not said is that this was a vast improvement compared to what had happened earlier. In the mid 1700s, it was 74.5%. So industrialization was making life better, not worse. But Charles Dickens, like so many other early anti-poverty activists, doesn't know this. So he and others conclude that the poverty they saw was caused by industrialization and the so-called free market, when in reality, poverty was decreasing because of industrialization and the free market.
All right, I got to stop there for just a minute and kind of tie this into what to me is kind of mind blowing and interesting. You can see the kind of the ghostly figure of Charles Dickens over Tick's shoulder there to remind us of Dickens's role. Dickens, of course, a Unitarian, a worker against poverty. And what we've just learned is that poverty in the cities is nowhere near as bad as poverty was in the countryside, where these people left a serfdom, a life of total poverty, and found that actually the Industrial Revolution has provided an out from really a hellish existence on a farm where your life expectancy is short, where your wife or you are not going to have but maybe a third or a quarter of your children survive to adulthood. A sad and terrible, as you know, nasty, brutish, and short, I think is the phrase. And it's not part of what we really learn as history. We kind of mythologize all these serfs as, kind of somehow happy and having their harvest time, and they, have dances, and they frolic, and they have their 12 days of Christmas. And, the idea of serfdom being really uh, drudge work in which you have no hope of improving yourself and you don't get an education at all. Well, that's what Tick is reminding us of here. So, with that background, the idea that the Industrial Revolution wasn't so bad for the people, and generally the ones that were, the 80 or 90% of the people that just worked on the farm or the manor or the great estates of the wealthy and the nobles. So, here's an interesting new way for me to look at it.
I know he's a fictional character, but Oliver Twist would have died had he been born in the 1700s, whereas he had a much better chance of survival because he was in the early 1800s. Despite the great success of classical liberalism in boosting wealth, living standards, lifespans, liberty, peace, education, and technology faster than ever recorded in human history, its achievements were continuously scorned by wealthy adversaries with ulterior motives, and ideologues with political ends to serve. I have to at this point give a shout out to the book Killing History, The False Left-Right Political Spectrum by L.K. Samuels. It's a fantastic book, highly recommended for various reasons, and no, this isn't a sponsored video. I'm not getting commission, and I only recommend books I genuinely think are good and would be of interest to you on a given topic.
And I'm going to order this book because I think one of the themes that we absolutely have to force into people's minds is that left right is false. I attended the Saturday session of the Center for Political Innovation, Caleb Maupin's organization. There was people there from the left and people there from the right. Scott Ritter was there. He, of course, a Reagan Republican. Garland Nixon there, a self-described leftist in the past. However, he made the distinction, as I think we all need to do, and say, no, it's between them and us. It's between the totalitarian state and the individual freedoms that we own and have to preserve. So that's, I think, another thing that attracts me to TIK is that he's beyond the left-right Hegelian dialectic.
Now, I have been reluctant to do this, but I hereby declare my aversion to the left and right political spectrum, and all spectrums. I've given up on the whole thing. Calling something left and right or whatever just muddies the water because the terms have been shackled with deliberate distortions that cause confusion. Therefore, it's better to abandon political spectrums altogether in favour of looking at the individual policies of a given faction and then judging them accordingly. You might disagree with this approach, but well, these terms just aren't helping. So, with that in mind, we have all this industrialization and urbanization going on, and standards of living for the poor were slowly getting better. But there was an establishment backlash against this. In the 1840s, the Conservative Party was the pro-statist party. They stood for authority, monarchy, nationalism, high taxes, and heavy intervention in the economy. The Conservative Party exists to conserve. It is the party of the status quo. And what was the status quo back in the 1840s? Monarchy, authority, high taxation, and heavy intervention in the economy to prevent the poor from improving their standards of living.
Okay, again, I'm going to stop just because I think that's important point that we don't think of as a conservative in the 19th century, and the British Conservative Party is the party of high taxes, is the party of laissez-faire in the sense of let the poor people starve, is the party of the rentiers, the ones that you have to pay rent to and who don't have to do any work. And it is the party of the nobility and the king and the queen and everybody else. They are intervening in the economy. How? To prevent the poor from improving their standards of living. To prevent the poor from improving their standards of living. Look at how that is the same idea that gets John F. Kennedy killed when he wants to help the so-called third world, Africa, Indonesia, the Asian countries, to build on their own resources and become free in their own way. No, the economic forces of the Western monetary system, the British, American, Wall Street, synarchist combinations are going to stay united against the poor countries to keep them poor. That is why there's no development, because it's a policy to keep the poor poor.
They wanted things to go back to as they had been before the Industrial Revolution. They wanted to be the lords on the manor, with the poor and starving peasants working their fields. That's why they were against change, because of what had happened in the French and Industrial Revolutions. Now, yes, technically they were opponents of other utopian political visions, but that doesn't mean that they were against all utopian visions. They wanted to protect the church and the aristocracy, who they believed were central to British society at the time. And again, they wanted a feudal-style Britain because that was their utopia, because they were the landowners. Thus, they were pro-taxation and pro-protectionism because taxation benefited the government, who were the aristocrats, and protectionism would benefit them because they owned all the farms. During the 1870s, the large-scale imports of cheap grain from North America triggered a long-term decline in agriculture, marked by falling rents and land values, which left a generation of country gentlemen and aristocratic landowners disillusioned with conventional conservatism, and was eventually to make them susceptible to extremist politics. So the conservative aristocrats were pro-state. They were statists, mercantilists, nationalists. It was the Conservatives who implemented the income tax in the 1840s, because up to this point, taxes had been largely indirect, and they wanted direct taxation on the industrialists who were benefiting the poor. They didn't want to get rid of the Corn Laws, which had previously been implemented to protect British agriculture by guaranteeing high food prices that had to be paid by the poor. If you want to know why people were going hungry in the 1800s, it wasn't because of evil capitalists, it was because of statist price setting, high regulation, and taxation. In other words, it was a lack of a free market, and the Conservatives weren't the industrialists. They were against the free market and the industrialists. That was who they were implementing regulations and taxation against. And by the way, the source I'm using for this is a standard history book, not someone from the Mises Institute or something. The historians are largely in agreement with what I've just said, so this shouldn't be controversial, but I know that people's perceptions of what the Conservatives are is different to what they actually are. They've just implemented higher taxes on the poor and businesses, and lower taxes on the establishment aristocracy. And last year, when Comrade Zonak got in, he raised taxes. That's why they're known as the Low Tax Party, because they always implement low taxes on the establishment and higher taxes on the rest of us. They've been consistent throughout their entire political history. Now, yes, there have been times where they lowered taxes or got rid of regulations. The political situation had changed in the 1850s because the British people were all in favour of a free market. The people understood that free markets resulted in better living standards. So Conservative leader Disraeli realised in October 1849 that the Conservative policy of protectionism was costing them votes.
All right, I'm going to stop just because there's so many new concepts coming at us quickly here. I wanted to make a comment as to what he just said. He's saying that the conservative policy has always been to extract as much as they could from the poor, and also when the industrialists come along, you can't look at the industrialists as allies of the conservatives. They're not. The conservatives want that rentier money, that money from the large estates that they own. They're the lords of the manor. And they envision that going on in perpetuity, as we talked about one time in the idea of the motto "Semper Eadem," the motto of Queen Elizabeth I, and also the motto of Prince George's County, Maryland, where I grew up. Semper Eadem means a manor style life. Everything's always going to be the same. There's always going to be a lord of the manor. There's always going to be serfs or slaves, and there's always going to be artisans of wheelwrights, and the whole idea of that contained agricultural plantation is what they wanted. So they didn't want this industry to come along and improve people's lives. The people will leave the farm and they won't have that cheap labor anymore.
And thus political power, since most of the society was in favour of free trade. So they turned in favour of free trade to get elected.
And let me make a point about free trade here too, because this is one of the big confusing issues. Free trade in the sense that there's no taxes. So like, for instance, if I was for free trade today in the state of Maryland, I would have to go out and say I'm against the sales tax. I would say I want free trade, meaning there's no tax, there's no impediments to me trading. And while a lot of us think of the regulations as impediments to trade, and that's why we want free trade, was to get rid of regulations, well, that is the part that you hear from the Republican Party all the time. But that is only part of the thing that stops trade. What really stops trade is taxation. Nobody thinks of that. That's why I think this point that TIK is making here that everybody was in favor of free trade back then, when free trade meant no taxing, no government involvement in my business deals. That was kind of the good side of liberal economics in the days of the 1800s to 1850. And that, of course, is the time when, not only was Dickens writing about the poor, but the opium trade was taking off like crazy, and free trade became the banner of the big opium traders, as opposed to the banner of the small working person. As the idea of free trade and sailors' rights was a political slogan in the U.S. in the 1830s and 40s. Sailors' rights, of course, referring to the War of 1812 and the British impressing our seamen, but free trade meaning, hey, the government stays out of my business and I can do what I want. I can go out and work for somebody without having to pay taxes, and I can sell my goods without having to pay a sales tax. That idea of free trade, this is a different way of looking at it entirely.
But that was a political ploy. They still remained the party of the establishment, the state, and remained a high tax and protectionist party. Disraeli's greatest legacy to the Conservatives was to make them the national party. From the late 1870s, the Conservatives were able to wrap themselves in the Union Jack, and when all other tactics failed, they were able to identify themselves with a strong foreign and defence policy. Whatever else changed between Disraeli and Thatcher, that at least remained the same. Thatcher implemented the poll tax, almost doubled VAT, and it was increased again during John Major's term and again under Cameron's term in 2010. Yet, despite this, people vote for them hoping for lower taxes. No, they hate the free market and for higher taxation, regulation and protectionism, and they always have been. On occasion, they might lower taxes to win votes or for stability reasons, but usually they raise them again or lower them against one part of the economy and higher them on another. They've never been low tax. Now, why am I bringing this up? Well, where did Mosley start his political career? The Conservative Party. Forget left and right and up and down or any of that nonsense. Look at the facts. Mosley was an aristocrat. He was Lord Mosley. He was pro-monarchy, pro-taxation, pro-regulation, pro-autarky protectionism. He was against the free market. He was against industrialists, the businessmen, and the self-employed. He thought that they all should be forced into a giant hierarchical structure led by an aristocratic type elite. That's why he started in the Conservative Party, because that's what the Conservatives have always been about. Now, he did disagree with certain policies of the Conservatives, even when he was first elected in 1918. He disagreed with the hereditary principle of the House of Lords, and he was in favour of modern reforms for the British state. He was also against aliens, in this case the Germans living in Britain, because he thought that they were reducing wages, underselling goods, ruining English social life, and also spreading disease. Okay? However, even at this point, he believed that the British state should provide welfare and education for the British people, a typical Conservative position. Why is that? Well, it's because, as we just saw before, Conservatives are the aristocratic elite. They want higher taxes for themselves, so by providing limited welfare and an education, they can impose higher taxes and pocket the rest. However, Mosley wasn't your typical Conservative. He seems to have genuinely believed that the British people should be looked after by the British state. And he disagreed with the Conservative government's policies in Ireland at the time. He questioned the use of British troops and compared their tactics to that of the Germans in Belgium during the First World War. He was branded a renegade by his fellow Conservatives, and therefore in November 1920, after 2 years in the Conservative Party, Mosley crossed the floor and became an independent. As one historian has said, the Irish controversy signalled the start of Mosley's liberal moment. Now, Mosley stays independent for a couple of years before siding with the Liberal Party. He doesn't become a Liberal member, but he's basically with them for a short time, So it's worth talking about the Liberals. The Liberal Party had its origins in the Whig Party, which had its origins in the 1600s, but we'll start off in the early 1800s. The Whigs were against the Conservatives. They were for free trade and property rights. They were basically the Adam Smith Party. They weren't ANCAPs by any stretch of the imagination. After all, they were an aristocratic faction, but were classical liberal in their outlook. Individual liberty was seen as something to aim for. However, there was a flaw in their reasoning. Some argued that liberty could only come about if the state intervened in the life of the people. Liberals had no scruples about interfering with the poor, even without their consent through the vote, in the interests of improved social morality as they understood it. They weren't entirely free market, through no fault of their own. Everyone's understanding of economics back then was primitive, as it is for a lot of people today. They were still operating under the Labour theory of value, since the subjective theory of value was only discovered in 1871. So back then, they didn't really understand what was going on. So while they freed the slaves in 1832, they implemented legislation that banned football and animal fighting, and said that it was okay to dissect the bodies of people who had died in the workhouses. They also weren't a zero-tax party. They implemented interventionist legislation, but they certainly were more hands-off than the others. Skipping over a whole complex history of various factions and infighting, the Liberal Party emerges from the Whigs, sort of, by the 1860s. But there's a problem. Poverty still existed, and people started to falsely assume that laissez-faire economics was causing this poverty. Dickens's socialist propaganda, because it was socialist propaganda, falsely blamed poverty on laissez-faire economics. But he wasn't the only one. A Hegelian
And I'm just stopping again to make this point that laissez-faire economics to most people is what the British did to the Irish during the Holocaust, or what most people call the potato famine. It was laissez-faire. They don't have any potatoes. Too bad. Mother Nature is doing it, and we should keep our hands off of it. And that's what some people would call laissez-faire, but it's not, because they were stealing the food. The Irish were also growing, cattle and pigs and all kinds of crops, but that was all sequestered and taken off by the British Army to Britain and other places that the British wanted to send it to. So that wasn't laissez-faire. That was complete intervention. In fact, it was genocide, according to the studies of our good friend Christopher Fogarty. And that laissez-faire idea was not, it was not laissez-faire, although people tend to call it that. It's one of the psychological difficulties we have now, because what real laissez-faire would be the government really does stay out of it and doesn't come and seize your food or tax your income. So this is where the change starts to happen when we get into the 20th century, and this confusion of what the words mean has real policy implications.
called Thomas Hill Green started the ball rolling in the 1870s, followed by one of his students, a guy called Arnold Toynbee, who questioned the idea of laissez-faire economics being good for society. Toynbee especially believed that the poor were being trampled by it. Of course, he had a perfect solution. Toynbee viewed the state as something more than a mechanical contrivance for material ends, as a union of men for the highest purposes of human nature. I would like to point out that Green and Toynbee were Hegelians, and I think it's extremely interesting that they went to the Liberal Party to demand reform. The Conservatives were the party for the strong state, yet Green and Toynbee went to the Liberals, the laissez-faire market party. That's very strange. But anyway, because of the Hegelian attack, John Stuart Mill, who had been a classic liberal, had a crisis of confidence and basically turned into a socialist as a result. He wasn't a Marxist, He became a classic utopian socialist, believing that private property and money should still exist, but that society should help the less fortunate, because he now believed that freedom for the individual could only occur under the guiding hand of the state. So the old classic liberalism of laissez-faire economics was under attack, and the liberals began to think that they should intervene in the more extreme cases of poverty, or when it was deemed that the free market had failed. In the 1880s and 1890s, Roundtree and Booth published studies on poverty and basically confirmed to everyone that laissez-faire was anything but fair. Now, I want to make it clear that the free market wasn't causing this poverty. The free market was pulling people out of poverty during this period. Between 1870 and 1914, the amount of food consumed by the British people skyrocketed. All departments of life showed improvements. People ate and dressed better. Many items once considered luxuries now were being mass-produced. Furniture, books, pictures, carpets, cigarettes, pianos, watches, neckties, and roller skates entered general circulation. Similarly, entertainment became universally accessible. Annual consumption of goods increased markedly. Consumption of sugar rose from £12 per person in 1870 to £34 in 1907. That of beer from 78 litres in 1872 to 123 litres in 1900. In 1873, average annual consumption of meat was about £59 per person. That had gone up to £105 in 1912. The guys back in the 1800s should have known this. Yes, they didn't have the statistics that we do now, but one of Karl Marx and Engels' disciples, Eduard Bernstein, who was one of the people who buried Engels at sea, could tell with his own eyes that the poor were getting richer as a result of laissez-faire. He began to deviate from Marx in the early 1890s and started publishing literature against Marx's ideology. So if he could see it, why couldn't any of the laissez-faire guys? But regardless, as a result of the crisis of confidence brought on by the Hegelians, a radical faction emerged and eventually took over the Liberal Party. By 1890, old liberalism had died and new liberalism was cast to the side, although it wouldn't die completely until about 1911. New liberalism effectively abandoned laissez-faire and free market economics and was decisively more interventionist, almost socialist. In order to differentiate the two, the liberalism of the 17th and 19th centuries has been dubbed classic liberalism, also called laissez-faire liberalism, while the more contemporary version has been labelled modern liberalism, social liberalism, or nanny-state liberalism. The so-called New Liberals then went on to implement policies like state pensions, school reform, and so on. Nothing dramatic compared to what came later, but enough for historians to note the significance, and also the change in tactics. By 1890, the socialists seemed to pose a serious threat in the possible creation of an independent working-class party. Progressive liberals responded to these socialist threats by advocating lib-lab cooperation and by supporting working class and industrial reform. In one sense then, the change from the old to the new radicalism lay in the new orientation towards socialist reforms. And indeed, the border between the left wing of liberalism and the right wing of the socialist groups was so indistinct that it depends mainly on point of view whether some individuals are classed as radicals or socialists. They favoured the same practical reforms. The Fabian Society is also involved here, and the fact that the Hegelians were there as well, I don't know, my spidey senses are tingling. The fact that they went for the classic liberals and not the conservatives really strikes me as suspicious. And the fact that the liberals folded so easily just doesn't make sense, especially since the vast majority of the British public were still laissez-faire advocates. Up until the late 1880s, the workers and their bosses, the so-called capitalists, were on the same team. Yes, there was a union movement, but it wasn't until 1889 that the two sides started to clash. Again, really suspicious in my opinion. The major basis of liberal support came from an alliance between the middle class and the working class. This alliance was made possible because working class voters generally shared middle class goals and middle class assumptions about the nature of the economy and of politics. The great bulk of the working class in the 1860s and 70s was still pre-industrial in the modern sense. The typical workman was a craftsman or a small-scale capitalist. In the economic world of these small-scale producers, it was still possible to rise by thrift and self-help. These working-class voters therefore shared the middle-class ideal of individualism, and as small-scale producers, they did not see the capitalist as their class enemy. Until the end of the 1880s then, the leaders of organized labor had no desire to use politics for economic ends. So wait, there's no antagonism between the workers and their employers throughout most of the Industrial Revolution until the late 1880s, which just so happens to be when the laissez-faire Liberal Party abandoned their free market economics. Let me just read that first line again. The major basis of liberal support came from an alliance between the middle class and the working class.
All right, and I want to stop there as well and just make a couple of comments about that. Think about your typical kind of mythical American dream of lifting yourself up by your own bootstraps, of Horatio Alger, of going out and selling newspapers until you have enough money to go into a real, some bigger business. And then one day you become a millionaire, and then you can give your money to charities and you can help other people get started and lift their own selves up out of poverty. And this idea of individual initiative and in innovation and invention and thinking of, oh, a better mousetrap, the idea that we can actually use our brains to improve not only our own lives, but the lives of everybody in the whole world if we apply ourselves to it. The idea of I am a very free and empowered individual because I live in a free country where everybody supports the ideas of freedom. And that includes the people that own the factories, the people that own the mills, the people that own the means of production, until what happens? Until the Industrial Revolution, which was a good thing in Benjamin Franklin's day, something that lifted people out of poverty, gets taken over by who? Well, of course, it's the banking system that can lend money on, excuse me, on a fractional reserve system where, I have $1,000 in my bank, but I can lend it out 9 times because I know that the odds are that not all 9 of them are going to want their money back at any one time. And if they do, I've got to deal with my friend, the banker over in the next town, and he'll lend me the money so that we have a cartel going and we never go broke. That idea of the bankers always win is what's behind all the wars. And that is what destroyed the unity between the working person and the capitalist, the person that invested in, a 30-year project, a 50-year project. We're going to build up something very important for our town or for humanity generally, and I want to be a part of it. I want to sling a hammer on that project, and I'll be proud of it when it's done. Like the Amish when they put up a barn, it's a good thing. It's wonderful to feel the community working together, but voluntarily because you want to be part of it, and not as a serf, and not as a wage slave, and not as someone who gets to get up every morning at 5 o'clock and get on that treadmill, which will last the next 12 hours as you drive into the city and then get exhausted and drive out of the city and come home too exhausted to have a relationship with your family. How did that happen? Politics has subverted the economic principles that existed during the beginning of our country in the first part of the 19th century. Politics fueled by economic conditions created by the wealthy, the elites. And so what TIK is telling us here, and I want to emphasize this because I think, if we understood what happened to liberalism, what he's saying is that liberalism was pretty much this American ideal until the 1890s, 1900s, when a Toynbee comes along who, schooled in the Dickens idea of the industrialists are keeping the poor down, and we must use government to intervene in order to improve the lives of the downtrodden. That by subverting the idea of the Liberal Party from a party of free trade to a party of government regulation and subsidy, then you've played into the hands of whom? Of the conservatives. Because the conservatives are the ones that want everybody else to pay taxes. And when the taxes come in, if it costs them, 20% or 40% of the tax take to subsidize the social justice projects of the Liberal Party, whether it's, free schools or, national health or something else, they'll throw that money at it because they're still making a huge profit off of the taxation and off of the free labor and off of the fact that they are not getting taxed anywhere near the percentage that working people are getting taxed. It's the same principle that we have with Social Security right now. And we have a Social Security system, but the wealthy don't have to pay into it anywhere near the percentage of their income as the working class does. And if they had to, then the Social Security problem would be gone. But they don't. Why don't they? Because they have the political power to say no. And neither party will stand up to those elites because they already own the purse strings of our democracy, so-called. So TIK History, a fantastic series if you like to watch the battles and the wars unfold, and hear a really expert analysis while it's going by. Or look at his economics series. His work on Oswald Mosley, an entire show on him is really worthwhile. But the one before this one is he goes into the difference between oops, sorry, between fascism and National Socialism, and that is important. The idea that fascism and National Socialism were the same thing it's really difficult to get past that one. He does a good job in tangling them and showing why, in the beginning, Mussolini was not anti-Semitic. He was not. He had a Jewish mistress, and he was not an anti-Semitic person until he got involved with Hitler. But it was still fascism. So it's not necessary to be a racist to be a fascist, but it is necessary to be a racist to be a Nazi. There's a lot more to it than that, but it's a fascinating uh, program, the difference between fascism and National Socialism over at TIK. So I really do recommend his work to you, and I thank you for your attention this morning. I apologize to my viewers over on Rumble. I will see to it that this gets posted as soon as possible for a replay. All right. And by the way, tomorrow night it's going to be Mark and David back for a Wednesday night trio. And hopefully we can do this on Rumble and avoid the censorship problem. It should be very interesting with all that's going on. Dr. Malone and getting called out by George Webb. Interesting.